Caitlyn, the sheriff of Piltover. Born into a wealthy and influential merchant clan, Caitlyn Kiriman swiftly learned the social graces of life in Piltover, but preferred to spend her time in the wilder lands outside it. Equally adept at mingling with the moneyed elite of the City of Progress or stalking a deer through the mud of the forest, she could confidently track a bird on the wing over the merchant districts, or put a shot through the eye of a hare at 100 paces with her father's repeater musket. Caitlyn's greatest assets, however, were her intelligence and willingness to learn from her parents, who reinforced her understanding of right and wrong, even within a life of comfort and privilege. Her mother was one of the highest controllers in Clan Kiriman, and would always warn Caitlyn of Piltover's seductions, and its gilded promises that could harden the kindest heart. At first, Caitlyn paid little heed. To her, Piltover was a place of beauty and order that she cherished after each trip into the wild. All that was to change one progress day, some years later. Caitlyn returned to find her home ransacked and empty. The family retainers were all dead, and there was no trace of her parents. Caitlyn secured the house, and immediately set out to find them. Tracking within the confines of a city was very different from hunting in the wild, but, one by one, Caitlyn located the thugs who had invaded her family home. The trail eventually led her to a hidden safe house, where her mother and father were being tortured for information. She rescued them under cover of darkness, and alerted the Piltover wardens, though not one of the kidnappers they arrested knew the identity of the individual who had hired them, only a proxy with the initial C. Caitlyn and her parents began to rebuild their lives, but something fundamental had changed. Her mother in particular could no longer face the politics and duplicity of clan life, and gave up her prestigious role, leaving something of a vacuum in the Kiriman leadership. And, though she loved her parents dearly, Caitlyn had no desire to take her mother's place, nor to learn her father's trade as an artificer. Instead, her focus turned toward breaking through the web of intrigue surrounding the mysterious C. Utilizing her hunting skills, she established herself as a private investigator, and quickly made a name for herself as someone who could find anything or anyone. In recognition of her self-made success, Caitlyn's parents crafted her a Hextech rifle of exquisite artifice, with greater accuracy than any musket. The weapon could take a variety of specialized shells, and be easily modified in the field. After a particularly traumatic case involving a missing Hextech device and a series of child abductions, Caitlyn was summoned by the wardens. She had been recommended by one of their number who had also developed something of an affinity for stranger cases, and their battle with a host of rogue chimerics in the employ of a lunatic chem researcher driven mad by his own concoctions led to her being offered a formal position as a sheriff. At first, Caitlyn refused, but eventually came to realize that the warden's resources could potentially get her closer to discovering the true identity of C. Caitlyn has since become a highly respected officer within the ranks of the wardens, always striving to make the City of Progress a better and safer place. She recently partnered with a new recruit from Zon, the brash and reckless Vi. How such an unlikely pairing came about, and been proven so effective, is the subject of wild rumor and tavern speculation among their fellow wardens, as well as those they haul away to jail. What Caitlyn doesn't know, however, is that C is also keeping tabs on her, especially as her investigations bring her ever closer to the truth. The thrill of the chase. Even 3 bells after the Sun Gate had closed, Piltover was still full of life that was currently getting in her way. Caitlyn sprinted down Mainspring Crescent, weaving a path between midnight revelers strolling down the fashionable promenade of cafes and bistros. The supper clubs were emptying, as were the nearby theaters inside the Drawsmith Arcade, so this street was going to get a whole lot busier. If they didn't catch up to Devki soon, they were going to lose him. "Do you see him?" shouted Mohan from behind. "If I could see him, I'd already be drawing a bead on him." The Hextech rifle slung over Caitlyn's shoulder was loaded and ready to shoot, but she needed a target, and Devki was more nimble than a spooked doe. He'd robbed 3 clan workshops, that they knew of, in the last 5 weeks, and Caitlyn had him pegged for 2 others. Working a hunch that something big was in the works, she and Mohan had been keeping watch on one of House Morichi's workshops, and sure enough, Devki had shown. Though they hadn't known it until the city lighters had worked their way down the street to ignite the glow lamps and Caitlyn caught his reflection in the glass of the cafe across the street. Devki had seen her in the same instant, and took to his heels like a startled wharf rat. Caitlyn skidded to a halt at the next junction. The caged flames atop the fluted lampposts bathed the dozens of surprised people staring at her with a warm, amber light. Her pale blue eyes darted from person to person, seeking Devki's distinctive silhouette. A young man crossed the street toward her, his cheeks ruddy with a night's enjoyment. He waved at her. "You looking for a man on the run?" he asked. "Fellow with a big hat?" "Yes," said Caitlyn. "You saw him? Where did he go?" The young man pointed left and said, "Down that way at a good clip." She followed his gaze and saw cheering theater-goers spilling from the Drawsmith Arcade, a vaulted structure of colored glass and ironwork columns. They mingled with stallholders selling refreshments and promenade girls looking for a wealthy mark. Mohan finally caught up to her, sweating and breathing hard. He bent at the waist and propped himself up with his palms on his knees. His blue uniform coat was askew, and his hat tipped back over his head. "Figures he'd try to lose himself in the crowd," he said between gulps of air. Caitlyn took a moment to study their public-spirited helper. His clothes were finely tailored and must once have cost him a pretty penny, but the cuffs were frayed and the elbows worn. Her eyes narrowed as she took in last season's colors and a collar that hadn't been in style for a year. Wealthy, but down on his luck. Mohan turned toward the busy street and said, "Come on, Caitlyn. Let's go or we'll lose him." Caitlyn dropped to one knee to look at the street from a different perspective. The cobbles were slick from the evening rain and were well trodden. From this angle, she saw the scuffs of heel marks on stone that only a running man would leave. But they weren't heading left, they were heading right. "How much did Devki give you to tell us that?" said Caitlyn to the unfashionably dressed young man. "If it was less than a gold hex, you were swindled." The young man put his hands up and said, "It was 5, actually," before turning tail and running toward the crowds with a laugh. "What the?" said Mohan, as Caitlyn sprinted in the opposite direction. She'd lost valuable seconds, but knew exactly where Devki was going now. She soon left Mohan behind, her sometime partner a little too fond of the sugared pastries the district inspector's wife made for her husband's officers. Caitlyn ran a winding path through the city, along seldom-traveled alleyways and crooked paths between the gables of tall, brick-fronted warehouses. She cut across busy streets, drawing cries of annoyance from those she barged out of her way. The closer she came to the great canyon bisecting Piltover, the narrower the streets became, but she was betting she knew the shortcuts of Piltover better than Devki. After a dozen twists and turns, she emerged onto a crooked street of undulating cobbles that followed the jagged line of the cliff. Known locally as Drop Street thanks to the wheezing hydraulic conveyor at the end that ran late into the night, it was deep in shadow. The iron-framed cabin hadn't yet opened, the lozenge-patterned grill still in the closed position. A group of 15 Zonites, a great many of whom were intoxicated, gathered around the ticket booth. None of them were the man Caitlyn was looking for. She turned and dropped to a crouch, resting the barrel of her rifle on a packing crate bearing the brand of Clan Medarda. Stolen property, no doubt, but she didn't have time to check it. Caitlyn thumbed the rifle's primer switch to the upright position. A gentle hum built within the breech as she worked the action to ready a shot. She pulled the butt of the rifle hard against her shoulder and slowed her breathing. Her cheek pressed into the walnut stock and she closed one eye as she took aim through the crystalline lenses. She didn't have long to wait. Devki swung around the corner, his long coat billowing out behind him and his hat a tall silhouette. He appeared to be in no hurry, but then, he believed he had shed his pursuers. He held a heavy brass-cornered case in his metal-clawed hand, a crude thing Vice said he'd had done in one of Zahn's ask-no-questions augmentation parlors when he was a foolish youth. Caitlyn focused her aim on the pneumatic monstrosity and squeezed the trigger. A searing flash of orange-red exploded from the weapon's muzzle and Devki's hand vanished in a pinpoint blast. He cried out and fell back, his hat toppling from his head as the case fell to the ground. Devki looked up, his eyes widening in pain and surprise as he saw Caitlyn. He turned to run, but Caitlyn had been waiting for that. She toggled a thumb switch on the breech and pulled the trigger again. This time the beam struck Devki in the back and exploded in a web of crackling energy. Devki's back arched and he fell, twitching, to the ground. Caitlyn powered down her rifle and slung it over her shoulder as she walked toward the fallen Devki. The effects of the electronet were dimming, but he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. Caitlyn bent to retrieve the case he'd dropped and shook her head with a tut-tut sound. "Illich, how?" said Devki, through the spasms racking his body. "How did I know where you were headed?" asked Caitlyn. Devki nodded, the movement jerky and forced. "Your previous thefts were meaningless in themselves, but when I looked at them as part of a larger scheme, it seemed like you were gathering components to build a version of Vishla's hexaline caliver," said Caitlyn. She knelt beside Devki to place a hand on his rigid body. "And as we all know, that weapon was outlawed as being too dangerous, wasn't it? No one in Piltover would dare touch that kind of banned hex, but someone, maybe in Noxus. They'd pay handsomely for that, I imagine. But the only place you could get something like that out of the city is through one of Zaun's less reputable smugglers. This is the only quick route down into Zaun that's still running at this time of night. Once I saw you weren't going to try and hide out in Piltover, all I had to do was get to the conveyor before you and wait. So you and I are going to have a long talk, and you're going to tell me who you're working for." Devki didn't answer, and Caitlyn grinned as she reached over his prone body. "Nice hat," she said.
Thanks for watching. Keep enjoying our videos. Like and subscribe.